War has always been about guns, tanks, and courage. But every soldier knows the truth. An army marches on its stomach. By the early 1940s, Europe was starving. Blockades, bombings, and broken supply lines turned food into another weapon of war. In Germany, rations were measured by the gram. Bread was stretched with sawdust, coffee replaced with roasted barley, and meat became a distant memory for most civilians. Across the Eastern Front, German troops faced the same fate. Their supply lines froze in the Russian winter, and their air-in rations, a few biscuits and canned meat, had to last for days. Every march, every battle was shadowed by hunger. But far across the ocean, another army was rising, one that fought with factories, farms, and food. While Europe starved, America was planting, canning, shipping, and feeding an army bigger than any the world had ever seen. Soon, German soldiers would look across the lines and see something they couldn't believe. Enemy troops who fought hard, smiled often, and somehow always had a full plate. They were about to learn that in modern war, the battle wasn't just for ground, it was for the stomach of the soldier.
Every war has its front lines, the trenches, the skies, the seas. But behind every bullet fired, there's another war, fought in kitchens, fields, and factories. The war to feed the fighters. When America entered World War II, it faced an impossible equation. Millions of soldiers scattered across the globe, each needing 3 meals a day, no matter the weather, the distance, or the danger. That meant billions of meals every year. And yet the U.S. did it. It built the most powerful food supply chain in military history. Every farm in America became part of the front. Wheat, corn, beans, milk, all redirected toward victory. Women packed cans, soldiers hauled crates, and cargo ships carried food farther than armies had ever marched. While German supply trains struggled to reach the front, American convoys turned logistics into an art form. They could move an entire army and feed it across oceans. Generals called it the Forgotten Front, but soldiers knew better. Without it, no bomber would fly, no tank would roll, and no victory would ever be won. In the next part, the secret of that success takes shape not in a weapon or a factory, but in a small brown box that changed the way wars were fought.
For all its power, precision, and discipline, the German war machine had one fatal weakness. It could not feed itself. When Hitler launched his wars across Europe, he expected quick victories, not a drawn-out fight that would stretch his supply lines thin. But as the front expanded, so did the hunger. Germany had no vast farmland like America, no oceans of grain or rivers of cattle. Its empire was built on conquest, and when the conquered land starved, so did the conquerors. Rations became smaller, bread mixed with sawdust, coffee made from acorns. A single sausage might have to last a soldier 3 days. On the Eastern Front, things were even worse. Frozen supply trucks, burned railways, and endless distances turned every meal into a battle of its own. German soldiers often foraged, stole, or traded with locals to survive. Commanders wrote desperate letters home, not asking for ammunition, but for food. While their tanks ran on gasoline, their bodies ran on crumbs. Back home, civilians endured ration books and propaganda posters promising victory, while secretly wondering how long they could endure the hunger. Germany's soldiers could march, fight, and die with honor, but without food, they could not win. And soon, they would meet an enemy whose strength wasn't just in steel or strategy, but in supply.
When America went to war, It didn't just send soldiers, it sent everything. Factories, farms, railroads, and the endless power of an industrial giant moved together like one machine. In Washington, generals didn't just plan battles, they planned supply lines, stretching from the fields of Kansas to the beaches of North Africa. The American soldier was never meant to fight hungry. Every division, every unit was followed by a chain of food, fuel, and comfort, an invisible army of cooks, drivers, and clerks feeding the men who carried the guns. While Germany rationed its bread, the United States built floating bakeries on ships. While enemy troops boiled muddy water for soup, American mess halls served hot coffee and real meat in the field. This wasn't luxury, it was strategy. A fed soldier fought longer. A rested soldier aimed better. A well-supplied army could move faster than hunger could follow. It was war fought with numbers, machines, and logistics, the American way of war. And when German officers finally saw how well-fed their enemies were, they realized something terrifying. They weren't just fighting soldiers. They were fighting a nation that had mastered the art of feeding war.
Every American soldier carried a weapon, but in his pack, he also carried something just as vital, a meal. It didn't look like much, a small brown box stamped U.S. Army ration, but inside was a miracle of planning, science, and simplicity. Chocolate, canned meat, biscuits, powdered coffee, a few cigarettes, and sometimes even chewing gum. It was a kitchen in a crate, designed to keep a soldier marching, thinking, and fighting. To the men on the front, these rations meant survival. To the generals, they meant something even more powerful: mobility. A soldier could fight for days without supply trucks. An entire unit could move through mud, snow, or jungle without losing its strength to hunger. Every item had a purpose. Every calorie was calculated. It was food turned into engineering, a meal that could fit in a pocket, survive a storm, and keep a man alive. To German troops who boiled turnips in helmets and scraped together stale bread, the American ration box was almost unthinkable, a symbol of abundance in the middle of destruction. Some called it a meal in a miracle. Others called it the taste of America. But for the soldier opening it under fire, it was something simpler, a reminder of home.
It began not in a factory, but in a laboratory. In 1941, as the United States prepared for war, one question challenged its military planners. How do you feed a man who might fight anywhere on Earth? The answer came from a quiet nutritionist at the University of Minnesota, Ancel Keys. He wasn't a general, but he would create one of the most important weapons of the war, the K-Ration. Keys studied the science of survival, how long a soldier could fight, march, and think on the smallest, lightest, most efficient food possible. The result was a small box that weighed less than 2 pounds and could keep a man alive for a full day. Each pack, breakfast, dinner, and supper, was perfectly measured. Meat, biscuits, chocolate, gum, sugar, powdered drinks, and even a few cigarettes for morale. It could fit in a pocket, survive heat, cold, and ocean spray, and be eaten in a trench or a cockpit. The K-Ration wasn't meant to taste good, it was meant to win wars. Soldiers joked about it, but they carried it with pride. It symbolized American ingenuity, feeding freedom, one box at a time.
And when German prisoners saw how well their captors ate, they realized something that no ration could hide. This was a nation that had turned science into strength.
Before a single ration reached the front, it had to survive its own battle, the test of war itself. In labs, fields, and training camps across America, soldiers volunteered, or were volunteered, to eat the strange new meals of the modern army. Ansel Keys and his team fed them under every condition imaginable. In freezing Minnesota winters, in blazing desert heat, and deep in humid jungles that spoiled food in hours. The goal wasn't comfort, it was endurance. Could a man fight for days on a handful of calories? Would the food last months in a damp foxhole? Would it keep morale alive when everything else fell apart? The results shaped everything. If one item molded too quickly, it was replaced. If soldiers hated the taste, it was reformulated. If it was too heavy, it was redesigned. Every bite was a calculation. Every complaint, a correction. By the time the K-Ration reached the front, it had been eaten, studied, and improved 1,000 times. It wasn't a chef's masterpiece, it was an engineer's. And when the first shipments left American ports, they carried more than food. They carried the science of survival. Because in this war, the best tested meal could mean the difference between victory and starvation.
War doesn't pause for dinner, but somehow the Americans found a way to serve it anyway. Across Europe and the Pacific, the U.S. Army rolled out one of its quietest revolutions, the mobile field kitchen. Steel boxes unfolded into stoves. Cooks in helmets stirred vats of stew beside roaring engines. Steam rose from muddy fields, while shells fell miles away. The mess sergeants were as vital as any officer. They could feed 200 men on a road that barely existed, or turn canned rations into something that smelled like home. Where German soldiers gnawed at cold bread and horse meat, American troops got hot coffee, scrambled eggs, and stew. They joked that the kitchen trucks were worth more than tanks, and in a way they were. Because morale, not just munitions, fueled an army. A hot meal meant a soldier could fight another day. A taste of home meant he could remember why he was fighting. To the astonishment of captured German officers, the U.S. could feed an advancing army with the precision of an assembly line, hot, ready, and everywhere at once. It was logistics as strategy, warfare run through a cookpot. And in those smoky field tents, over metal trays and laughter, America's secret weapon wasn't a rifle or a tank. It was a meal, served warm, right behind the front.
Every bullet, every tank, every meal, someone, somewhere had to move it. Behind the thunder of the front lines marched another army, one without glory, but without whom there would be no war at all. They were the truck drivers, quartermasters, mechanics, railroad men, and dock workers, together known simply as the Logistics Army. They crossed oceans on cargo ships packed so tight with crates there was barely room to breathe. They unloaded in storms, on beaches still echoing with gunfire. They built roads where there were none, bridges out of wrecked steel, and depots from the ruins of cities. For every division fighting, 5 divisions fed it, fueled it, and fixed it. They kept tanks warring, aircraft fueled, and soldiers eating 3 times a day. The Germans couldn't believe the scale, that the U.S. Army could move mountains of supplies across continents and still deliver them on time. It was war fought with spreadsheets, maps, and endless convoys. The front might have carried rifles, but the rear carried the war itself. And when historians call it the arsenal of democracy, they forget this part, that the arsenal didn't just build the weapons, it moved them. Through mud, snow, and fire, the logistics army advanced one crate at a time. They never made headlines, but without them, the headlines would have been written in another language.
War isn't just fought with bullets. It's fought with comfort. For American soldiers, 3 small things became symbols of home: chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes. In every ration box, beside the canned meat and hard biscuits, there was always a little sweetness. A Hershey bar that melted in the desert or froze solid in the Ardennes. But to the men who opened that box under fire, it tasted like America itself. Coffee was the Army's lifeblood, boiled in helmets, brewed in tin cups. Its smell drifted through the camps before dawn, turning weary men into soldiers again. No matter how bad the day, as long as there was coffee, morale stayed alive. And cigarettes, those slim, burning links to sanity, they were traded like gold, shared like friendship, and lit in silence between brothers in arms. Even prisoners and enemies would exchange them, because in war, a smoke could mean a truce, a moment of humanity. German prisoners couldn't believe it, how the Americans always had more. While their own supplies dwindled, U.S. soldiers seemed to live in a world where comfort never ran out. Chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes, 3 small luxuries that carried the taste, the smell, and the spirit of home to the farthest corners of the earth. They didn't win battles, but they helped men survive them.
Every German soldier marched with one faithful companion, a small metal tin clattering against his pack. Inside was his ration can, the Eiserne Portion, the iron ration. Dark bread, a smear of meat paste, maybe a few biscuits and coffee substitute made from roasted barley. It was meant to last 3 days, but sometimes it had to last a week. German soldiers called it the Box of Despair. It was survival in steel form, cold, efficient, but joyless. There was no chocolate, no real coffee, no comfort. In muddy trenches and frozen forests, men scraped the bottom of those tins with their bayonets, hoping for one more bite. Even officers shared the same tasteless spread, a symbol of equality born not from pride, but from scarcity. Then they saw the Americans eat. Hot meals, fresh bread from mobile bakeries, real coffee steaming in metal cups. While German troops rationed crumbs, the Americans fed an army as if the war barely slowed them down. To the German soldier, that tin became a bitter reminder of what their enemies had and what their own empire could no longer provide. The Eiserne Portion began as a symbol of strength, but by 1944, it tasted like defeat. The Eastern Front wasn't just a battlefield. It was a wasteland that devoured men, machines, and meals alike. When the German army marched into Russia in 1941, they carried supplies for weeks, believing victory would come quickly. But as the front stretched over 1,000 miles, supply lines snapped under the weight of winter and distance. Food froze solid before it could be eaten. Canned meat cracked open like ice. Bread turned to stone. Soldiers warmed tins over burning fuel, risking enemy fire just for a taste of something warm. By the second winter, hunger became the real enemy. Field kitchens, goulash cannons, couldn't reach the front lines through mud or snow. Men boiled horse meat, tree bark, even leather belts to survive. Meanwhile, American Lend-Lease trucks rolled east, bringing supplies to the Soviets: flour, canned meat, and powdered milk. The Germans saw a cruel irony. Their enemies were fed by their own industrial failures. Letters from the front spoke of men too weak to fight, hands trembling on rifles, minds dulled by starvation. Commanders begged Berlin for food, but Germany itself was starving. The Eastern Front didn't just consume armies. It consumed rations, morale, and hope. For many German soldiers, it wasn't the Red Army that broke them. It was the emptiness of their stomachs.
War isn't always won by bullets or bombs. Sometimes it's won by empty stomachs. On the Eastern Front, hunger became a silent weapon, one that spared no army. But for the Germans, it cut deeper than any wound. The farther they advanced into Russia, the more their supply lines stretched thin. Fields that once fed them burned. Villages were stripped bare, first by retreating Soviets, then by desperate troops. The German High Command turned starvation into strategy. They seized crops, livestock, and grain, believing they could feed their army from conquered land. But they forgot one thing: winter doesn't surrender. When the snow came, those stolen fields became white deserts. The people starved, the soldiers starved, and the Soviet resistance hardened with fury. In Stalingrad, hunger was a siege weapon. German troops boiled wallpaper for the paste. They ate rats, horses, even candle wax. Letters home were filled with one word over and over again: Brot, bread. While in the West, American troops dined on hot stew, bread baked in mobile ovens, and coffee brewed by the gallon. Their bellies were full, their energy endless. For the Germans, hunger became a punishment. For the Americans, food was a morale weapon, a symbol of abundance that the Axis could never match. And by 1944, the contrast was impossible to ignore. German POWs stared in disbelief as U.S. soldiers shared chocolate and meat rations freely. It wasn't just food. It was proof that America could feed an army and still have plenty left over. And in a war where factories built victory, the kitchen had done its part.
Behind every battlefront, there was another war. A war of wheels, roads, and relentless motion. America's secret weapon wasn't just tanks or planes. It was logistics. It was the convoys. Long before dawn, columns of olive-drab trucks stretched across the horizon, dozens, sometimes hundreds in a row. Engines growled, tires chewed mud and snow, and crates stacked high with fuel, rations, and ammo rolled toward the front like a moving lifeline. Each truck carried a piece of the war: bread for breakfast, shells for artillery, gasoline for Shermans, mail from home. It was an army behind the army. The Red Ball Express, the legendary highway of supply through France, became a symbol of American speed and endurance. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, drivers, many of them African-American soldiers, risked air raids and ambushes to keep the front fed and fueled. To the Germans, it was unthinkable. Their armies crawled on horse-drawn wagons, their fuel rationed drop by drop, their soldiers eating less each month. But the Americans? They ate hot meals in the field, drove freshly repaired tanks into battle, and always had coffee. Always. When captured German officers saw the convoy routes, their disbelief was almost anger. How can a nation so far away feed and fuel so many men? The answer was simple: planning,
production, and power. The American convoy was more than supply. It was momentum, unstoppable and endless. And as long as the trucks kept rolling, so did victory.
War was mud, thick, cold, and everywhere. It swallowed boots, jammed rifles, and turned every trench into a swamp of misery. But even there, in the worst of it, the Americans found a way to eat hot. In the middle of chaos, field kitchens roared to life. Steel stoves rattled on truck beds, steam rose from pots, and the smell of stew drifted through the rain. They called them mermite cans, insulated metal containers that carried heat like a secret weapon. Inside were scrambled eggs, beef stew, or mashed potatoes, still steaming hours after leaving the kitchen. Mess crews worked under fire, cooking in ditches, behind barns, even in cratered fields. They built stoves from scrap metal, used tank fuel to boil water, and somehow made dinner in the middle of destruction. To the Germans watching from across the lines, it made no sense. How could their enemies fight all day and still sit down to a warm meal? For American troops, it wasn't luxury, it was survival. A spoonful of hot food in the mud was a reminder of home, a burst of strength when everything else was cold and gray. One soldier wrote in his journal, "Hot chow is worth more than medals." And in that mud, amid gunfire and exhaustion, the smell of coffee and stew was the smell of victory.
They weren't on the front lines. They didn't charge into battle or fire a single shot, but without them, the war would have stopped cold. They were the Quartermaster Corps, the invisible army behind the army. While soldiers fought in mud, snow, and fire, quartermasters fought with numbers, maps, and time. Their battlefield was the supply chain, and their weapon was organization. Every bullet, blanket, and biscuit had to move at the right hour, on the right truck, to the right place. One delay, one mistake, and an entire division could go hungry or unarmed. They managed mountains of cargo: food, fuel, uniforms, tents, tires, tools. They tracked every crate and ration box from American factories to European foxholes. Their motto was quiet but powerful: first in, last out. They arrived before the fighting started, and they didn't leave until the last man did. When soldiers in France opened a fresh tin of stew, when a mechanic got a new engine part, when a wounded man was wrapped in a clean blanket, it was the Quartermaster Corps that made it happen. They were never in the headlines, but their work kept the headlines possible. And though the enemy never saw their faces, they felt their impact in every full stomach, every fueled tank, every army that refused to slow down. Because behind every victory, there was someone making sure the right box arrived at the right place, just in time.
They weren't carrying rifles, they were carrying ladles. But to the men on the front lines, these cooks were just as vital as any soldier with a gun. They were the GI cooks, the unsung chefs of the battlefield, turning chaos into comfort, one meal at a time. Amid explosions and mud, they built makeshift kitchens from wrecked jeeps and oil drums. They scrounged for ingredients, fought rain, snow, and enemy fire, just to make sure their unit had something warm to eat. Coffee brewed in helmets, biscuits baked in tin cans, meat stews simmered on gas burners, while artillery thundered in the distance. One veteran later said, "Hot chow could turn a freezing foxhole into a home." GI cooks worked around the clock. They rose before dawn to prep meals, served them in shifts, and washed up long after the last patrol returned. They learned to improvise, If the beans ran out, they stretched rations. If the stoves broke, they built new ones. And if a convoy was delayed, they fed hundreds with whatever they had. Enemy soldiers were stunned when they captured abandoned American positions and found half-eaten plates of hot food still steaming. It was proof of something the Germans couldn't match: America's ability to feed its fighters anywhere, anytime. For the men in the mud, these cooks were more than kitchen hands. They were morale, hope, and humanity, served 3 times a day. And though they didn't wear medals, every spoonful they served was a quiet act of courage.
The front was never still. Tanks rolled, boots marched, and trucks thundered forward, a living wave that stretched for miles. And behind it all came the question every commander feared: how do you feed an army that never stops moving? For the Americans, the answer was genius in its simplicity: mobility. Convoy kitchens were packed tight in trucks and trailers. Field rations were sealed in tins built to last through anything, and supply routes were timed like clockwork. Breakfast could be served at sunrise in one village and lunch miles away before the sun hit noon. Every soldier carried a backup meal in his pack: K-Rations, compact, balanced, and indestructible. 3 small boxes a day kept a man marching, each one labeled breakfast, dinner, supper, a simple promise that food would always come. Meanwhile, along the highways of Europe, field kitchens set up in minutes. Canvas tents, folding tables, steaming pots, the Army's own traveling diners. When the front advanced, the kitchens followed. When it retreated, they packed up and moved overnight. In North Africa, cooks learned to keep sand out of soup. In Italy, they hauled rations up mountains by mule. In France, they turned apple orchards into open-air mess halls. German soldiers couldn't believe it. Their own troops starved during long offensives, while the Americans ate meat, vegetables, and hot coffee on the march. The U.S. Army had turned food into fuel and logistics into a weapon. An army that eats well fights longer, harder, and never stops. And that's exactly what America built: a force that could move anywhere and eat anywhere.
To most soldiers, war tasted like metal: the tang of rations, the smoke of gunfire, the dust of marching roads. But every now and then, it also tasted like home. That home came sealed in olive drab cans, stacked by the thousands in convoys that never stopped moving. Inside, meat and beans, hash and stew, peaches swimming in syrup. Simple things, but to a soldier crouched in a trench halfway across the world, it was more than food. It was memory. He could open a can of peaches and be 12 again, sitting at his mother's kitchen table in Kansas, or eat creamed beef from a tin and think of Sunday breakfast back home. The U.S. Army knew that morale mattered as much as ammunition, so the Quartermaster Corps didn't just feed men, they tried to feed their hearts. C rations came with little surprises: a pack of cigarettes, instant coffee, chewing gum, a square of chocolate wrapped in foil. Tiny comforts that said, "You're not forgotten." Even captured German soldiers were shocked. They opened American ration tins and found variety, flavor, and warmth. Meanwhile, their own meals had shrunk to cold bread and thin soup. It wasn't gourmet, but in a muddy foxhole under enemy fire, a warm can of beans or a spoonful of fruit was enough to lift spirits and steady hands. It was the taste of home, carried in crates across oceans, kept safe through battles, and opened on the front lines of history. And long after the war ended, many veterans would say they could still remember that first bite: sweet, salty, metallic, and the strange comfort it brought.
When the shooting stopped, many captured German soldiers expected punishment.
cold cells and hunger. What they found instead was lunch. At American POW camps, mealtime came with trays of food that stunned the prisoners. Stew, bread, vegetables, even coffee and dessert. For men who'd survived on watery soup and black bread, it felt impossible. They whispered among themselves, "Is this a trick? Are they feeding us better than their own?" But it wasn't a trick. It was the American way. The U.S. Army fed its prisoners according to the Geneva Convention and then some. They believed that how you treated a man in captivity said something about what kind of nation you were fighting for. German POWs couldn't believe the variety. Fresh fruit, canned meat, butter, sometimes even eggs. They watched American guards drink milk, eat full meals, and realized that this abundance wasn't just for show. It was normal. One former prisoner later wrote, "We thought America was a land of propaganda. Then we tasted its food. We knew it was real." Some POWs worked alongside American civilians, earning small wages. And when payday came, they bought candy bars, cakes, and Coca-Cola from camp canteens. They compared it to what they'd eaten in the Wehrmacht. Frozen bread, weak coffee made from acorns, and half rations that vanished before the day was done. Many couldn't stop talking about the food. Not the battles, not the defeat, the food. Because it wasn't just nourishment, it was proof. Proof of an industrial power so vast it could feed its soldiers, its allies, and even its enemies. And as the war faded, those meals left a lasting impression. For many German POWs, America's greatest weapon wasn't its tanks or planes. It was its kitchen.
The rumor spread fast through the barbed wire. New prisoners, just off the transport trucks, stared in disbelief as others ate from steaming trays. Hot stew, real bread, coffee, fruit. This wasn't punishment, it was a feast. One captured German sergeant whispered, "They eat like kings." And for men who had survived on crusts and thin soup, it wasn't an exaggeration. The U.S. Army didn't run its POW camps with vengeance. It ran them with efficiency and discipline. 3 meals a day, balanced portions, and more calories than most civilians in war-torn Europe were getting. Breakfast might include oatmeal or eggs. Lunch, a thick stew or meat and potatoes. Dinner, a vegetable plate, bread, and sometimes dessert. To men raised in a culture of rationing and scarcity, it felt almost unreal. Many couldn't stop comparing. In Germany, their own soldiers were starving on the Eastern Front, cutting horse meat from carcasses just to stay alive. Yet here, in captivity, they were fed better than they had been in uniform. Some POWs were moved to silence. Others laughed bitterly. A few refused to eat, thinking it must be a trick. But the truth soon became clear. This was simply how the Americans lived. Food wasn't just sustenance. It was a reflection of a system that worked. To German officers, the message was humbling. Their once proud Reich couldn't even feed their own men, while America could feed millions, soldiers, civilians, and captives alike. In diaries smuggled home after the war, one phrase appeared again and again. The Americans, they eat like kings. And behind that phrase was a quiet realization that the strength of the United States wasn't only in its weapons or wealth, but in the simple, everyday miracle of a hot meal served without hate.
You could measure victory in tanks, planes, or tons of steel, but there was another ingredient, invisible yet powerful, that kept the American war machine running: morale. It was the unseen fuel that turned exhaustion into endurance, fear into focus, and rations into comfort. Every warm meal, every cup of coffee, every bite of chocolate was more than food. It was a message that said, You still matter. You're still human. Commanders knew it. The Quartermaster Corps knew it. Even the cooks in muddy field tents knew it. A fed soldier fought better, aimed steadier, and smiled more. When a hot meal reached the front lines, men stood taller. When mail came with it, letters, photos, a taste of home, they remembered why they were fighting. Morale wasn't built in speeches or parades. It was built in the quiet moments. The smell of coffee at dawn, the laughter over canned peaches shared between friends, the feeling that somewhere, far away, a whole nation cared enough to feed you well. German troops, by contrast, ate what they could find, cold, rationed, and rationed again. Their morale eroded meal by meal. Empty stomachs made heavy hearts. But the Americans had turned food into a weapon of spirit. They didn't just feed soldiers, they reminded them who they were. One general put it simply, "Our men don't just fight on courage, they fight on coffee." Because behind every victory, beneath every flag and battle plan, was that secret ingredient, a warm meal, a full heart, and the will to keep going.
By the 1940s, America wasn't just fighting with bullets and bombs, it was fighting with science. Behind every ration tin, every energy bar, and every sip of coffee stood an army of scientists, doctors, and dietitians determined to answer one question: how do you feed a man for war? The U.S. Army called it sustained combat nutrition. Every calorie, every vitamin was measured, tested, and optimized, not for comfort, but for endurance. In laboratories across the country, chemists studied how to keep food fresh through jungle heat and desert sand. They invented packaging that could survive explosions, dehydrated meals that could fit in a pocket, and chocolate that wouldn't melt in the tropics. This was the birth of field food engineering. They discovered that men with the right balance of protein and carbs marched farther, shot straighter, and stayed alert longer. The K-Ration became a masterpiece of practicality. 1,200 calories of compact power, enough to keep a soldier alive and fighting for 24 hours. It was science turned into sustenance. Meanwhile, German troops relied on simpler meals: bread, sausage, and whatever could be scavenged. Their nutrition dwindled as supply lines broke. The science simply wasn't there. But America's experiment worked. The body became a machine, and science kept it running. Every pilot, every tanker, every Marine carried a laboratory's worth of calculation in his pack. It wasn't luck or luxury. It was nutrition turned into power. When German officers saw American troops, well-fed, strong, alert, even deep in enemy territory, they realized this was more than logistics. It was strategy at the molecular level. In the end, the soldiers who understood food as fuel outlasted those who saw it as mere survival. Because in the new war, science fed the victory.
The war had ended. The guns were silent. But for millions of American soldiers, one question remained: what's for dinner now? After years of tin cans, powdered eggs, and mystery meat, the return to real food felt like victory itself. They had marched on Spam, survived on K-Rations, and dreamed of one thing: a hot steak. Spam became a symbol of both pride and exhaustion. It had fed armies across Europe and the Pacific, a miracle of mass production and preservation. It was cheap, salty, reliable, and despised by the war's end. GIs joked that Spam had won the war and nearly ruined their taste buds doing it. When soldiers came home, they wanted more than survival in a can. They wanted flavor, freshness, and freedom on their plates.
and America was ready to deliver. Factories that once churned out rations now filled supermarkets with abundance. Refrigeration, packaging, and transport, all perfected by wartime science, were turned toward feeding the peace. Steak dinners, buttered potatoes, and milkshakes became the new reward of a nation that had sacrificed everything. To eat well was to live again. In Europe, German POWs who had tasted American rations told their families about the unbelievable meals of their captors. For them, Spam was a luxury compared to hunger. For Americans, it was the memory of endurance, the flavor of hardship that made victory sweeter. The transition from Spam to steak was more than a change of diet. It was the story of recovery, pride, and the return of the human appetite after total war. Because when the smoke cleared and the world began to rebuild, America didn't just feed its people, it taught the world how to eat again.
War is often measured in bullets, tanks, and bombs. But in truth, it's also measured in calories. The German army marched on empty stomachs, rationed bread, thin soup, and ersatz coffee. Their supply lines were stretched, their fields bombed, and their soldiers hungry long before they were beaten. Across the ocean, America fought a different kind of war, a war of abundance. While German soldiers gnawed at stale bread in the snow, American GIs unwrapped chocolate bars, brewed real coffee, and ate hot stew under canvas tents. Behind those meals was a miracle of logistics, a vast network of farms, factories, railroads, and ships that made sure a soldier in Normandy ate almost as well as one in Kansas. It wasn't luck, it was design. The United States had turned food into a weapon, a source of morale, strength, and speed. The Quartermaster Corps, nutritionists, and engineers studied every calorie, every ingredient to keep men strong, alert, and ready to fight. While German industry struggled under blockade and bombing, America's bread baskets overflowed. Tank factories stood beside canneries. Steel and grain, both rolled out by the ton. And when captured German soldiers saw the meals of their American counterparts, many could hardly believe it. "They eat like kings," one prisoner whispered. In a war of attrition, food became a declaration of power. For every panzer, America could send 10 Sherman tanks. But for every hungry German platoon, it could feed 100 GIs 3 times a day. It wasn't just superior firepower, it was superior sustenance. The ability to feed millions, anywhere, anytime, kept the Allies marching when the Axis starved. From wheat fields in Iowa to the battlefields of Europe, America proved that victory was as much about supply as strategy. And when the war ended, the proof lay not in the ruins, but in the kitchens and mess tents, where full stomachs built unstoppable armies.
In America's war machine, 2 lines kept the world turning, the assembly line and the mess line. One built the weapons, the other fueled the men who used them. Both ran with the same precision, the same rhythm, and the same unstoppable momentum. At the Ford plant in Michigan, workers turned out tanks, trucks, and jeeps every hour. At the same time, in vast kitchens and field depots, cooks and quartermasters turned out thousands of meals, each one timed, tracked, and shipped like ammunition. It was all connected. Every bolt tightened in Detroit meant one more ration packed in a crate. Every tank rolling off the line was followed by food, fuel, and faith, because an army that eats moves. The U.S. Army didn't just feed soldiers, it engineered how they ate. Recipes were tested in labs, nutrition measured like horsepower. Even the humble can of beans was a product of science, sealed, sterilized, and standardized so it could cross an ocean and survive the front. And when the machine stopped for maintenance, the soldiers stopped to eat. The clang of steel and the clatter of mess trays became the twin sounds of total war. In Germany, the contrast was striking. Factories ran on fumes, and soldiers ate what little the supply trains could bring. But in America, the mess line ran as efficiently as the machine line. Food, fuel, and firepower were 3 parts of one system. It wasn't just industry that won the war. It was organization, the knowledge that victory depended as much on a full stomach as a full magazine. Every ration packed in a bar car, every sandwich served in a field kitchen was another bolt in the machinery of triumph. When the soldiers lined up for lunch, they stood in the same spirit as those who lined up for work back home, both fighting the same battle on different fronts. The mess line and the machine line, 2 rivers of strength, flowing together to power an army that never stopped.
Victory doesn't just come from courage, it comes from calories. Behind every push across Europe, behind every landing, every dawn offensive, was a simple truth: you can't fight on an empty stomach. The U.S. Army knew it, and they made sure their soldiers never forgot it. They called them Rations of Victory. Metal tins, canvas bags, and cardboard boxes, each one packed not just with food, but with energy, planning, and purpose. Inside was more than meat and bread. It was science. Carefully balanced proteins, sugars, and fats, engineered to keep men fighting in mud, snow, or desert. The C ration, the K ration, the 10-in-1, each designed for a different mission, each tested by dietitians and soldiers alike. C rations for the front, heavy cans of meat and beans that could take a beating. K rations for the march, light, quick, and compact, fitting neatly into a pocket or a pack. And the 10-in-1, a feast for a squad, filled with coffee, fruit, soup, and sweets to turn a patch of ground into a dinner table. But these weren't just meals, they were morale in a box. A bite of chocolate in a crater, a sip of hot coffee after a night patrol, a pack of cigarettes or a stick of gum. Small comforts that reminded every man he was still human, still fighting for a life beyond the war. Meanwhile, across the lines, German soldiers rationed bread down to crumbs, their supply trains shattered by Allied bombers. They scavenged, they starved, while the Americans kept moving, fueled and fed. That difference, that endless supply of food and faith, was as powerful as any tank or bomber. Because America had learned the secret: you can't win a war on weapons alone. You win it on rations. Every can, every crate, every meal that reached a muddy foxhole was another step toward victory. They were more than food. They were the taste of home, the proof that an army's strength comes not just from muscle and machinery, but from the will to keep its soldiers alive, one bite at a time. These were the Rations of Victory, the quiet, constant heartbeat of the world's most powerful army.
When the war ended, America didn't just bring its soldiers home, it brought home everything it learned. The battlefield had been a laboratory. Every ration, every supply convoy, every factory schedule was an experiment in how to feed millions, anywhere, anytime. And those lessons would reshape the modern world. The packaging that once carried beans to the front soon carried breakfast cereal to families. The tin cans that survived artillery blasts became soup cans on suburban shelves. Freeze-drying, vacuum sealing, instant coffee, all born from war, all reborn for peace. The same scientists who balanced combat rations turned their minds to household products. They learned how to keep food fresh longer, how to ship it faster, how to make it ready in minutes. The GI who once tore open a K-Ration came home to find TV dinners and instant meals built on the very same technology. Supermarkets exploded across America, aisles lined with goods that owed their existence to wartime innovation. Shelf-stable milk, canned fruit that stayed sweet for months, powdered eggs, even chewing gum, refined and perfected by the same companies that supplied the troops. The logistics miracle that fed the front lines now fed the home front. The supply chain of war became the economy of peace. And just as the bomber factories became car plants, the ration factories became food companies. Kellogg's, Kraft, Nestle, General Mills, brands that carried forward the spirit of wartime efficiency and abundance. What began as survival became convenience. What once fed soldiers would soon feed nations. From the mud of Normandy to the gleaming aisles of the supermarket, the story was the same. American ingenuity finding a way to nourish life in any condition, at any scale. War taught America how to feed an army. Peace taught it how to feed the world.
It wasn't just bullets and bombs that won World War II.
It was taste, the taste of home, the taste of comfort, the taste that reminded a soldier why he was fighting. Every army needs morale, and morale often came in the form of a meal. For the Americans, that meant more than calories. It meant familiarity. Beans and bacon, coffee and chocolate, the same flavors a soldier grew up with, now served from a can in a muddy foxhole. The U.S. Army knew that food was more than fuel. It was a connection. A hot cup of coffee before dawn, a slice of white bread toasted over an engine block, a bar of Hershey's chocolate after a march. These were reminders of family, of safety, of purpose. The German soldier had discipline. The Japanese soldier had obedience. But the American soldier had spirit, fueled by taste. Even field rations were designed to taste like home. Army nutritionists worked with chefs and psychologists to make sure every bite carried familiarity, not just sustenance. When the men smiled after a hot stew or soup, officers took note. Morale rose, performance improved. And that morale was contagious. POWs noticed it. Allies envied it. Even the enemy couldn't ignore it. Captured German soldiers often marveled, Americans eat like kings. They weren't exaggerating. While Europe starved, the American GI had meat, coffee, fruit, even dessert. Not because he was lucky, but because the U.S. made food part of strategy. Factories didn't just produce weapons, they produced happiness, packed in cans and crates, shipped across oceans, delivered right to the front lines. Every bite was a reminder that America wasn't just fighting to destroy, it was fighting to preserve a way of life, a life that tasted like freedom, warmth, and home. And when victory finally came, soldiers remembered the meals as much as the battles. They remembered that, in the darkest trenches of war, A spoonful of soup could lift the spirit higher than any medal. That was the real secret. Not the size of the army, not the power of the factories, but the taste that made men believe they were fighting for something worth coming home to. That taste was the taste that won the war.
When the last shots of World War II faded, the world stood in ruins, but America stood fed, fueled, and ready to rebuild. Its secret? Not just industry, not just numbers, but nourishment. From the first ration packed to the last meal served, America had proven a truth older than war itself. A full stomach builds a strong nation. While other countries rationed crumbs, America mastered abundance. It fed millions of soldiers overseas, millions of workers at home, and somehow never ran out. That power came from unity. Farmers in the fields, cooks in the camps, factory workers in aprons and overalls, all part of one machine that turned food into strength. Every can of beans, every loaf of bread, every steaming pot in a muddy camp was part of something greater, an invisible network that connected heartland to frontline. And that network didn't vanish when the war ended. It became the foundation of prosperity. Supermarkets, global trade, school lunches, a nation that believed feeding its people was the first step toward peace. The same hands that once packed rations now packed groceries. The same supply chains that once carried ammunition now carried flour and milk. The same spirit that kept soldiers strong would now keep families fed. Because America had learned a lesson that echoed louder than any victory speech. Strength begins at the table. Feed a soldier, and he fights. Feed a worker, and he builds. Feed a nation, and it endures. The war had been won not only with tanks and planes, but with spoons, stoves, and human hands. And as the world rebuilt, the United States carried forward that quiet truth, that true power isn't just in armies or weapons, but in the ability to nourish, to sustain, to give life. A full stomach meant a focused mind. A focused mind built a strong country, and a strong country could change the world. This was the legacy of the American kitchen, the field mess, the quartermaster, and the ration tin, the invisible heroes who proved that victory is born not only in battle, but at the table. A full stomach, a strong nation, a lasting peace.